we got the money, we're going to make the movie, You Are Leo Bloom. And I threw it on his makeup table.
At 99 years old, Mel Brooks has outlived nearly everyone who helped shape his world. The legends, the collaborators, the friends who stood beside him during comedy's golden age. What's left now isn't just laughter, it's memory and loss. In rare, unguarded moments, Brooks has opened up about the deaths that hit him the hardest. Some came without warning, others arrived slowly, painfully, over years. Each one carved a different wound. This isn't a roll call of famous funerals. It's the story of 7 losses that quietly broke a comedy legend in ways no punchline ever could. Gene Wilder. From the late 1960s through the early 1980s, parody comedy was in its absolute prime. This was the era when audiences packed theaters to see films that were smart, ridiculous, and completely unafraid to mock everything in sight. Movies like Airplane, Monty Python's Life of Brian, and The Kentucky Fried Movie didn't just succeed, they became cultural landmarks. These weren't niche comedies, they were events. At the center of that golden age stood one towering figure, Mel Brooks. Brooks wasn't just making parodies, he was reinventing them. Films like Blazing Saddles, History of the World Part 1, and Young Frankenstein didn't just spoof genres. They lovingly dismantled them while sneaking in sharp social commentary. And for some of his greatest work, Brooks had a secret weapon, Gene Wilder. Their collaboration became legendary, not just because of the films they made, but because of the spark between them. It felt like creative lightning, 2 completely different personalities somehow moving in the same direction. And yet, for all that magic, the Brooks-Wilder partnership was never smooth or friction-free. During the production of The 12 Chairs, Brooks offered Wilder a supporting role. Wilder wanted the lead. Brooks refused, bluntly telling him he didn't think he was attractive enough for it. The rejection stung, and it left a mark. As Wilder's solo career began to explode, distance grew between them. They were, at their core, very different people. Brooks thrived on ambition, speed, and constant momentum. Wilder was more reserved, more introspective. Brooks once described him as gentle to a fault in an industry that rarely was. The differences didn't erase their bond, but they strained it. Still, the connection never fully broke. When Gene Wilder passed away in August 2016 at the age of 83, the moment was quiet, intimate, and strangely poetic. He was at home, surrounded by family, holding hands as his favorite music played nearby. By chance, a song came on that seemed to say everything words could not. Somewhere over the rainbow filled the room as he took his final breath. Only later did the public learn how difficult his final years had been. Wilder had been living with Alzheimer's disease, slowly losing access to the very memories that had defined his life. At one gathering, he reportedly forgot the name of young Frankenstein and tried to remember it by acting out scenes. Even as memory slipped away, the performer inside him remained. Many fans wondered why he chose to keep his illness private. The answer revealed the depth of his kindness. Wilder understood what his work meant to people, especially roles like Willy Wonka. He didn't want to replace joy with sadness. He didn't want to take away a single smile. To him, protecting that happiness mattered more than public sympathy. In the years since his passing, Mel Brooks has spoken openly about the pain of watching his friend fade. In the documentary Remembering Gene Wilder, Brooks admits he struggled deeply with acceptance. He kept calling, kept joking, kept hoping that somehow humor could reach through the disease. Eventually, conversations became shorter, harder, and finally, impossible. Brooks describes the experience without bravado or comedy, just grief. He lost more than a collaborator. He lost a friend who had helped him shape some of the greatest comedies ever made. Dom DeLuise. Dom DeLuise first burst onto the public radar in the early 1960s with a character that perfectly captured who he was as a performer. Dominic the Great was a hopelessly clumsy magician, overflowing with confidence, yet doomed by his own incompetence. Every trick went wrong. Every reveal collapsed into chaos. And somehow, Dom played it all with such sincerity that audiences couldn't look away. The comedy wasn't just in the failure. It was in how hard he tried to keep going. He originally created the character for The Gary Moore Show, but it proved so popular that he carried it onto other major variety programs, including The Entertainers on CBS, where he worked alongside rising legends like Bob Newhart and Carol Burnett. He even brought the act to the Dean Martin Summer Show, placing himself squarely inside the golden age of television comedy. In 1963, DeLuise took a big leap onto the Broadway stage, making his debut as a cheerfully anxious con man with the unforgettable name Muffin T. Ragamuffin in The Student Gypsy. Almost immediately after, he did something unexpected. He appeared in the tense Cold War thriller Fail Safe, playing a nervous airline passenger. It was a rare straight role for him, and a reminder that, beneath the comedy, there was a capable dramatic actor. Still, comedy was where he truly belonged. With his round, expressive face, boundless physical energy, and that unmistakable booming laugh, DeLuise was built for humor. Films like The Glass Bottom Boat in 1966 leaned fully into that strength, casting him as a clueless spy whose every move somehow made things worse. Over the years, he attacked roles like that with fearless enthusiasm, often stealing scenes simply by being himself. By the 1970s and early 1980s, Dom DeLuise was everywhere. This was the peak of his film career, and he frequently found himself surrounded by comedy heavyweights like Burt Reynolds and Mel Brooks. Brooks, in particular, recognized something special in him. He understood that DeLuise wasn't just funny, he was joy incarnate. Their collaboration began in 1970 with The 12 Chairs, where DeLuise played the greedy and wildly unhinged Father Fyodor. It was the start of a long, unforgettable run. He followed it up as the overworked assistant director in Silent Movie, then delivered one of his most outrageous performances as Emperor Nero in History of the World Part 1. He even lent his voice to the grotesquely lovable Pizza the Hut in Spaceballs, and later brought operatic absurdity to Robin Hood. Men in Tights as Don Giovanni. Away from acting, DeLuise proved he was more than a performer. He was a genuinely skilled amateur chef, eventually hosting cooking segments on television and writing cookbooks that blended comfort food with humor and warmth. He also surprised many by writing children's books, showing yet another side of his creativity and heart. In May 2009, Dom DeLuise passed away at the age of 75 after a long illness. He died at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, with his wife and 3 sons by his side. Though no official cause of death was released, he had been dealing with serious health challenges, including high blood pressure and diabetes. Even so, those close to him noted that he seemed to be doing well just weeks before his passing. His death marked the end of a career that had spanned more than 60 years across television, film, stage, and voice work. But his legacy wasn't defined by awards or box office numbers. It was defined by laughter. Film critics often described him as naturally funny, someone who could ignite a room without needing a script. Directors like Mel Brooks knew that if they simply gave him space, something magical would happen. In fact, Brooks once admitted that working with DeLuise came with a unique challenge. He made everyone laugh so much that filming regularly ground to a halt. Brooks even planned for it. Every time he cast Dom DeLuise, he added extra days to the shooting schedule, knowing full well that the laughter would slow everything down. And maybe that's the perfect way to remember him. Sid Caesar. In February 2014, the world said goodbye to one of the true architects of television comedy. Sid Caesar passed away at the age of 91, closing the door on an era that helped define what comedy could be. To understand why his loss mattered so deeply, you have to understand what Sid Caesar represented. He wasn't just a performer, he was a foundation. Long before sketch comedy became a modern staple, Caesar was already mastering it, shaping it, and pushing it further than anyone thought possible. Alongside Imogene Coca, he created sketches that are still studied, referenced, and admired decades later. But his greatest legacy may not have been what audiences saw. It was who he inspired. According to his family, Caesar passed peacefully at his home in the Los Angeles area after a brief illness. With him went a living bridge to the earliest days of television comedy. For the writers and performers who worked under him, Sid Caesar wasn't just a star. He was a force of nature. Mel Brooks, who got his start writing for Caesar, often said that standing next to Sid on stage felt pointless. Not because of ego, but because Caesar could do everything. Voices, physical comedy, improv, emotion, and somehow do it all better. Brooks realized early that the smartest move wasn't to compete with him, but to write for him and watch the magic happen. And magic happened constantly. Most actors, Brooks explained, aim to simply deliver the material. Sid Caesar did more than that. He transformed it. He took sketches and lifted them to places the writers hadn't even imagined yet. Working with him meant watching your words come alive in ways that surprised even you. But Sid Caesar's legend didn't stop at comedy. He was also, quite literally, one of the strongest comedians anyone had ever known. Years later, Mel Brooks went on late-night TV to talk about his old friend, and didn't hesitate for a second. He called Sid a true comic genius, and it didn't feel scripted or polished. It felt personal. Brooks said he only agreed to come on because Sid deserved to be remembered the right way. He'd even visited him just months before he passed. And what stuck with him most was the relief of realizing the wit was still there. Caesar, even near the end, was still Caesar. One of his most famous abilities was his so-called double talk. He didn't actually speak multiple languages, but he could convincingly sound like he did. German, French, Italian. It all poured out in rapid-fire nonsense that somehow felt authentic. He never turned it off either. Even in restaurants, he'd launch into these performances, leaving waiters convinced they were hearing fragments of real language, even though none of it made sense. That skill was on full display in one of his most iconic sketches, The German General. Written by Mel Brooks and performed alongside Howard Morris, the sketch showcased Caesar's unmatched ability to blend physicality, sound, and rhythm into something unforgettable. Watching it decades later, it's still clear why audiences couldn't look away. Behind the scenes, Brooks often tried to convince Caesar to leave television and move into movies. He worried that television, especially in its early years, wouldn't preserve Sid's legacy the way film could. Caesar agreed with him, in theory. But every time he tried to leave, the networks made it impossible. His salary skyrocketed. His shows kept getting renewed. He was simply too good to let go. By the time those shows finally ended, years had passed. Caesar had already given everything he had to television. The moment had slipped away. Still, Brooks never stopped saying the same thing. Without Sid Caesar, there would be no Mel Brooks. It wasn't humility. It was truth. Carl Reiner. There are Hollywood friendships, and then there was Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner. This wasn't the kind of bond built on occasional phone calls or industry events. According to people close to them, they met every single night. Dinner, long conversations, an episode of Jeopardy, the same simple routine, night after night, for years. And somehow, that small ritual said everything about how close they really were. Together, Brooks and Reiner didn't just work in comedy, they helped shape it. Films, TV shows, unforgettable characters, entire generations influenced by their humor. But what made their partnership truly special wasn't just what they created. It was the genuine warmth and affection they had for each other. In their later years, seeing them together was deeply moving. Brooks, well into his 90s, would gently guide Reiner through old memories as they laughed about stories they had told 1,000 times before. There was joy in those moments, but also a quiet sadness. Time was catching up. Then everything changed. Just weeks after the world shut down in early 2020, Carl Reiner passed away. Only days before his death, he had shared a deeply personal reflection on his life, his marriage, and his family. Words filled with gratitude rather than regret. For Mel Brooks, the loss was devastating. The heart of the 2,000-year-old man was never the routine itself. It was Carl. Brooks often said that if he could make Reiner laugh, he knew the joke worked. Carl wasn't just his partner. He was his greatest audience. After Carl's passing, Brooks admitted that the things they once loved, like watching Jeopardy together, no longer felt the same. The shows were still there, the habits remained, but without Carl, the joy was gone. And yet, Brooks kept showing up. For an entire year after Reiner died, Brooks continued their nightly routine. He went to the house. He sat in the same spot. He ate dinner and watched television, even though his best friend was no longer beside him. Reiner's family later shared how deeply moving it was to witness. A quiet act of loyalty and love. Before Carl passed, the two men had spent countless hours together reminiscing about old music, classic films, and the performers who shaped them. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they simply sat and rested, letting time pass. Today, the chairs they sat in and the TV trays they used every night are preserved in a museum. A small but powerful reminder of something rare. Not just a legendary comedy partnership, but a lifelong friendship built on laughter, trust, and showing up every single night. Anne Bancroft. On paper, Anne Bancroft and Mel Brooks looked like the most unlikely match imaginable. She was elegant, tall, and intensely dramatic. He was loud, fast-talking, and happily self-deprecating. Even Mel liked to joke that while Anne was striking and glamorous, he was short and homely. And yet, somehow, they built one of the longest and happiest marriages in Hollywood, lasting more than 4 decades. People noticed the contrast immediately. Friends teased them. Outsiders labeled them an odd couple. Their backgrounds didn't seem to line up either. Anne came from an Italian Catholic family in the Bronx, while Mel was a Jewish kid from Brooklyn. Even their families noticed the cultural gap. Anne herself once joked that when Mel told his mother he was marrying an Italian woman, the reaction was dramatic enough to become family legend. But beneath all the surface differences, they had far more in common than anyone expected. Both were children of immigrants. Both grew up tough, ambitious, and determined in New York City. And both understood what it meant to fight for a place in an industry that didn't hand anything out easily. Even Anne's name reflected that journey. She wasn't born Anne Bancroft. She began life as Anna Maria Luisa Italiano and only changed her name after being encouraged by a studio executive. Mel loved telling that story, partly because it reminded him how much reinvention both of them had done just to survive in show business. What mattered most, though, was the respect they had for each other. Mel often credited Anne as the guiding force in his life. She believed in him without hesitation. Whether he wanted to write comedy, music, or films, she never questioned his ability. That quiet confidence pushed him forward again and again. In fact, Mel had admired Anne long before they officially met. Long before the romance, there was already awe. That brings the story to February 5th, 1961. Mel Brooks was sitting in on rehearsals for a Perry Como television special, tagging along with a friend. He wasn't working. He wasn't scheduled to meet anyone important. And then Anne Bancroft walked into the room. She was rehearsing in a white gown with jet black hair and a presence that stopped him cold. Mel later described it as instant and overwhelming. Something clicked. He didn't know if it was fate, luck, or pure chaos. But he knew one thing immediately. He was done for. When she finished singing, Mel realized it was only a rehearsal. Silence wasn't required. So he shouted his approval from the seats. Anne turned, surprised, and asked who he was. When he shouted back his name, she shocked him by recognizing it. She even mentioned owning one of his comedy records with Reiner. That was all the encouragement he needed. Anne mentioned she had a meeting at the William Morris Agency. Mel instantly claimed he had business there too, even though he absolutely did not. They shared a cab, and on the ride over, Mel sealed the moment with a loud, confident whistle that made her laugh. Years later, he would still brag about that whistle, convinced it played a key role in winning her over. From that point on, Mel pursued her relentlessly. He showed up everywhere she went, night after night. And after bumping into her for the fourth or fifth time, he tried to pass it off as destiny. Anne wasn't fooled. She called him out immediately. But the truth was, she felt it too. Anne later admitted that she knew quickly she had met the right man. So much so that she told her therapist there was no need to overanalyze things anymore. For Mel, there was never anyone else. He believed she had everything: beauty, intelligence, depth, and purpose. They married quietly at New York City Hall. It was the second marriage for both of them. Mel already had 3 children from his first marriage, and in 1972, he and Anne welcomed their son, Max Brooks, who would later become a successful author in his own right. The marriage lasted from 1964 until Anne's death in 2005, spanning more than 4 decades together. Looking back, Mel believed the reason it worked was simple. They grew up together. Over the years, they learned what really mattered: how to love deeply and how to show up for one another even when it was hard. They weren't perfect. They fought. Once, an argument got so intense that Mel stormed out and checked into a hotel late at night. But just a few hours later, he couldn't stand being away from her. He called, asked if she was awake, and came straight home. Even the hotel staff joked about how short his stay had been. Anne passed away from uterine cancer at the age of 73. Mel has admitted that the pain never really faded. In his memoir, he avoided writing about her death entirely because it still hurt too much. He doesn't actively seek out her films anymore, but if he stumbles across one on television, he can't look away. He watches until the very end, through the credits, often in tears. Even years later, he speaks about her with the same warmth and awe. When asked late in life about his favorite project, Mel didn't hesitate. Out of everything he had ever done, It was the film where he got to work side by side with Anne. Not because of the success, but because he simply couldn't get enough of her. Spending entire days together felt easy, natural, joyful. As a final act of love, Mel made it his mission to preserve her legacy. He helped bring together a collection of her greatest performances, ensuring future generations wouldn't just hear about Anne Bancroft, but truly see her. To Mel Brooks, Anne wasn't just a legendary actress. She was his partner, his anchor, and the great love of his life. In his eyes, she was a gift, one he never stopped being grateful for. Zero Mostel. In September of 1977, Broadway lost one of its most unforgettable forces. Zero Mostel, the actor whose performance as Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof became the stuff of legend, died suddenly at the age of 62. The cause was cardiac arrest, and it happened far from his New York home, inside a hospital room in Philadelphia. Mostel usually lived along Central Park West, but at the time he was in Philadelphia preparing for the pre-Broadway run of a new play by Arnold Wesker called The Merchant. It was a bold reinterpretation of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, and the production was moving fast. After Philadelphia, the cast was scheduled to head to Washington, D.C. for performances at the Kennedy Center before opening on Broadway at the Imperial Theater that November. Then everything stopped. Mostel was hospitalized with what doctors initially believed was a routine viral respiratory infection. There was no immediate sense of danger, but his condition deteriorated quickly. On the evening of September 8th, hospital officials confirmed that he had gone into cardiac arrest. He was pronounced dead at 7:47 p.m. The shock rippled through the theater world. The show's general manager admitted that no one knew what would happen next. The only thing anyone could describe was numbness. Tributes poured in almost immediately, and they all echoed the same truth. Zero Mostel was an actor's actor. Critics admired him, but audiences adored him. He could bring a theater to explosive laughter one moment and then break hearts the next by exposing something painfully human and fragile. Physically, he was unlike anyone else on stage. One second he could resemble a heap of rubber tires, slouched and chaotic. The next, he moved with surprising grace, like a massive animal tiptoeing delicately through space. He didn't just perform characters, he inhabited them completely. Nearly 4 decades later, that legacy was still alive. In March 2015, Mel Brooks walked onto the stage of the Aero Theater to honor what would have been Zero Mostel's 100th birthday. The audience rose to its feet before he even spoke. Brooks, ever the comedian, acknowledged the introduction with a joke, but the mood quickly shifted as he began talking about his old friend. To Brooks, Zero Mostel was a walking contradiction. He described him as both heaven and hell. When Zero felt generous, he was warmth itself. When he was ready to work, he was among the greatest talents ever to step on a stage. But when he didn't feel like working, he could be impossible. That unpredictability was part of what made him so powerful. Richard Pryor. Richard Pryor was a once-in-a-generation talent. Even decades later, his influence on stand-up comedy is impossible to escape. His honesty, his fearlessness, and his ability to turn pain into laughter set a standard few have ever reached. But alongside that, brilliance was a life marked by constant struggle, especially during a time when excess surrounded fame and escape was rarely encouraged. At the height of his success, Pryor was battling a serious addiction. It was a fight that quietly spiraled out of control and eventually led to a catastrophic incident just days before he was scheduled to begin filming History of the World, Part 1. What happened was sudden and life-threatening, leaving him hospitalized with severe injuries and throwing everyone around him into shock. Mel Brooks later wrote about that night, describing how impossible it was to even get through to the hospital. The phones were jammed with people desperate for news. It wasn't until days later that word finally came through that Richard was going to survive. Against the odds, he pulled through. What made Pryor extraordinary was what came next. He didn't just recover, he returned to the stage and transformed that pain into some of the most raw, personal, and fearless comedy ever recorded. He spoke openly about his flaws, his failures, and his fears, and somehow made audiences laugh while recognizing pieces of themselves in his truth. Meanwhile, production on History of the World, Part 1 had no choice but to continue. Pryor had been cast as Josephus, and with him suddenly unavailable, Mel Brooks considered removing the character entirely out of respect. It was Madeline Kahn who suggested another path forward, recommending Gregory Hines for the role. Hines arrived quickly, excited, but understandably nervous. He knew who the part had been written for and felt the weight of that legacy. Brooks, sensing the tension, did what he always did best. He used humor to put everyone at ease. It worked. The film moved forward, but the moment carried a quiet sadness. This had been meant to be the long-awaited on-screen collaboration between Brooks and Pryor. That missed opportunity echoed an earlier one. Years before, Pryor had been deeply involved in the creation of Blazing Saddles. The role of the sheriff was written specifically for him, and he co-wrote the script alongside Brooks. But despite his talent, the studio refused to insure him as the lead. His history made them nervous, and no amount of creative confidence could change that reality. Brooks was devastated, ready to walk away from the project altogether. Pryor, however, insisted the movie go on. He believed in the work more than his own disappointment and encouraged Brooks to find the right actor to carry it forward. That search led to Cleavon Little, whose audition immediately convinced Brooks they had found their sheriff. Working with Pryor during those years was unforgettable and unpredictable. Stories from collaborators paint a picture of a genius who lived on instinct rather than schedules. He could disappear without warning, only to casually explain later that life had simply carried him somewhere else. From a creative standpoint, he was unmatched. From a business standpoint, he was impossible to rely on. Despite everything, Mel Brooks never turned his back on him. As Pryor's health declined later in life, especially during his very public battle with multiple sclerosis, Brooks felt the slow heartbreak of watching a giant fade. Pryor spoke openly about his illness, refusing to hide from it, even as it took a visible toll on his body. In the end, it wasn't addiction or illness that took his life. In December 2005, Pryor suffered a heart attack at his home and passed away shortly after arriving at the hospital. He was 65 years old. Those closest to him said that, even in his final days, his spirit remained warm and upbeat. The legacy he left behind is enormous. To Mel Brooks, there was no debate. Among thousands of great comedians, Richard Pryor stood alone at the top. What Brooks remembered most wasn't just the genius. It was the joy, the laughter they shared, the jokes that broke through even the darkest moments, and the affection Pryor inspired in everyone around him.